Hello, and welcome to the Financial History Network webinar series 2020-2021. Today, we have the pleasure to host Dr. Sebastián Álvarez. He will be presenting his paper, The Shadow Central Bank, Banco do Brasil and International Finance, 1964-1988. Dr. Sebastián Álvarez is a Swiss National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow at the History Faculty of the University of Oxford, soon moving to the University of Zurich. His research focuses on sovereign debt, international banking, and financial crises during the decade leading to the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s. His first book, Mexican Banks and Foreign Finance, From Internationalization to Financial Crisis, 1973 to 82, has been recently published by Palgrave Macmillan. He holds a PhD in Economic and Social History from the University of Geneva, a Master's in Economics from the University of Paris I Panthéon-Sorbonne, and a Bachelor's in Economics from the National University of Córdoba, Argentina. So, welcome, Dr. Sebastián Álvarez, and the floor is all yours.
The Brazilian economy entered into a period of extraordinary growth with rates of about 11% per year during the so-called Brazilian miracle between 64 and 73, and then continued to grow at very high rates between 6 and 80% up to the 1980s. And it became one of the major and most dynamic economies of the developing world. Foreign finance was a fundamental piece of the Brazilian economic development during this period. Brazil was indeed the main recipient of euro credits and petrodollar liquidity that was being recycled in the euro markets after the oil shock of 73. And by the time of the outbreak of the debt crisis of 1982, the country was a large international debtor economy. In terms of its banking system, it went through a major reform in 64. And after this reform, the commercial banking system and the financial system in general experienced a very powerful expansion. And many of the Brazilian banks, most prominent institutions as Banco do Brasil, but also Banespa and other private banks, became indeed major players in the world at the regional level, also in the world capital markets. So there is a double motivation to this paper. On the one hand, there is large literature on the historical origin of central banks. And when it comes to Latin America, Brazil appears like a very kind of a typical case in the sense that while most of the major Latin American banks created the central banks in the 20s and the 30s, the Brazilian central bank was created much later in 64. And even then, it was not a traditional independent central bank, but it was a system in which the large federal Banco do Brasil, which was officiating a central bank up to that moment, kept also a monetary authority standing. And it was after the debt crisis of 82, towards the period that led to the constitutional reform of 88, that finally the monetary powers from Banco do Brasil was taken away, and it was consolidated the modern Brazilian central banking system. So the main question in the historiography has been why this process was so belated in Brazil. And the traditional answer, it was mainly due to the opposition of this powerful and highly politicized institution, which is Banco do Brasil, that didn't want to lose its prerogatives as its central banking and commercial banking functions. And in the other hand, there is also a very large corpus of literature about the different, the monetary, international, national monetary system in the post-Bretton Woods period, and the different institutional arrangements the central banks try to develop in order to deal with monetary policy, external imbalances in a context of high financial instability in the international capital markets, and a new system of flexible foreign exchange. So in this reason, Latin America in general, Brazil in particular, appear like very interesting case. In fact, if we take a look at Latin America during this period, we can see that there were a series of balance of payment crises during the 1970s and also then in the 1980s. As you can observe here for the main Latin American economies. And within this context, Brazil is an interesting case for two main reasons. First, despite its heavy reliance on imported oil, the country went through the 73 oil shock and the second oil shock of 79 without suffering a currency crisis. And the other reason is that unlike most of its Latin American neighbors, it didn't make recourse to the IMF either. So after the 68 standby agreement, Brazil kept signing IMF agreement every year up to 72, but without using any money, without withdrawing money from the fund. They stopped doing that, and the next agreement is in 83, already within the context of the international debt crisis of the 1980s. So, and this is particularly interesting if we take into account that the country was severely affected by these shocks, by the oil shocks. We can see here how the balance of trade moved from a quite virtually equilibrium during the Brazilian economic miracle period to a 5% deficit in 74 after the oil shock of 73, which started to improve, to decline over the following years, reach an equilibrium in 77, but then deteriorated again. In fact, if we look at the terms of trade, we can see that terms of trade were worsened during these crisis years, and that Brazil was considerably more negatively affected than the average Latin American country, that the region in general. So towards the end of the 1970s, the situation was even worse, because by that time the external debt levels were much higher, and there was also the rise of international interest rates that came up with the arrival of Paul Volcker to the Fed in the 1979 and the monetary contractionary policy he implemented. So in this paper, I will address two main questions. How did Brazilian monetary authority deal with the balance of payment imbalances? And then why was that the Brazilian dual central banking system was kept for so long? And these are interrelated questions in the sense that, as I will try to show and argue, the post-64 dual central banking system was fundamental for the management of the external account imbalances of the country during the 1970s until it collapsed with the outbreak of the Mexican crisis in August 1982. So I will develop a macroeconomic approach with some micro elements by looking at the relationship of Banco do Brasil and the central bank, and drawing on some primary sources, mainly the minutes of the board of the National Monetary Council in Brazil, but also some memos and reports from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Bank of England, and balance sheet data and financial statement data and other kind of data on the domestic and international operation of Banco do Brasil that are available also in the Brazilian secondary literature. So let me now say a few words about the post-64 financial and monetary system, the one that was enacted by the banking law of December 1964. So this law set up a system of a specialized banking in Brazil with different actors, different intermediaries, each one with its own fundraising and lending instrument, but it also created at the monetary level, it created the National Monetary Council, which was a collegiate body responsible for a design of the monetary and credit policy in Brazil, and also created the Central Bank of Brazil, which was to share responsibilities with the Banco do Brasil. As you can see in these diagrams, these two institutions were at the center of the Brazilian financial system, and both of them had a category of monetary authority. While the central bank was responsible for emission, was the lender to the treasury, and was responsible for lender of last resort, and also for the supervision of the banking system, Banco do Brasil continued to be the government bank and financial agent of the government. He was responsible to manage the clearing system, and therefore had the voluntary reserve of the banking system, and was also in charge of foreign exchange operation on its own behalf, but also on behalf of the central bank. So another salient feature of the evolution of Banco do Brasil during this period, it's that it went through a very important international expansion. So by 1964, the bank had only 4 agencies overseas. And you can see in this chart how this situation changed quite quickly, especially during the 1970s, with the bank opening offices, representative offices, agents, branches around Latin America, but also the rest of the developing and developed world, and as well as international financial centers. Banco do Brasil was in charge of the international trade policy of the Brazilian government, and for that purpose, the international network of foreign agencies and branches was important to promote Brazilian export and to conduct trade deals. But it was also important, and particularly those offices that were operating international financial centers, which are the ones we'll be focusing on now, were important because they provided direct access to the international capital markets and to the euro market, and they allowed for engaging in international lending and borrowing operations. So unfortunately, there is not much information on this network, the foreign network of Banco do Brasil, but there are there's a report, internal report from Banco do Brasil 74, said by that time the London agency accounted for about 40% of the assets of this international network, but over the following years, new agencies were created in financial centers. By 1982, there were 4 branches in the US, adding one in Miami, Los Angeles, San Francisco to the one, I continue, sorry. To the one in New York, it was opened in 69. But there were also other agencies in Paris, Tokyo, and offshore centers. So, and the importance of the US and London was that they provided access to the large US money markets and the London euro currency interbank market. So here we can see the asset and liability structure of the US agencies of Banco do Brasil, which had more or less by June 1982, had more or less $2.5 billion in assets. And we can see the wholesale nature of the funding base with this borrow money, which were credit lines from other banks accounting for about 70% of the liabilities. And then on the asset side, loans were only 10%, and the rest, the most important part were these claims with head office and affiliates. There is no, unfortunately, similar kind of data for the London agencies, but some report from the Bank of England that were prepared after the outbreak of the debt crisis shows more or less a similar structure. And here we can see the evolution of net interbank liabilities of the US agencies and the net claims with the head office as a share of total liability. And what we see that they move quite closely, they move together. These two. What it means is that these agencies were founding themselves in the US money markets and using these funds to provide liquidity to the head office or to the rest of the affiliates of the Banco do Brasil. And indeed, the US agencies and the London agencies play a very important role in in precisely providing dollar liquidity for the development of all the activities at the international level of the foreign banking offices of Banco do Brasil, but also, and in particular, to fund dollar loans that the bank was providing and granting to borrowers in Brazil, but also in other countries as well. So here we can see the international loans granted by the foreign agencies and Banco do Brasil to Brazilian borrowers between 1970 and 1985. Under the two external borrowing mechanisms that existed in Brazilian law. So the yellow bar represents the so-called Law 4131 loans, which were loans, syndicated credits or little credits granted to the public and public sector in Brazil. And the green bar is the Resolution 63 loans, which was the same kind of loan, but granted to the Brazilian banking system. The black line accumulate both. And what is clear here is the economic policy role played by Banco do Brasil through these agencies, activating lending. And this is something that has been highlighted by Davidoff Cruz, activating these agencies at times of very grave external imbalances, which is the 74, 76 period, and then the early 1980s. And if we take a look at the list of lenders, international lenders, and the Resolution 63 mechanism in the period of the 80s to August 82, Banco do Brasil is ranked at the top of the list. So mechanism and accounting for about 10% of the inflow of capital into Brazil under this mechanism. If we take a look at this chart, what it shows in the black bars, you see the amount that was lent from the foreign offices of Banco do Brasil to Brazil under Resolution 63 mechanism. And the green line shows what the amount that was borrowed from the Brazilian offices of Banco do Brasil. And they are almost perfectly matched, which means that the agencies were lending to the local agencies of the same bank. And then the question is, what were they doing with this money? Unfortunately, it's not very easy to answer this question because there is no information about what they did with this. But we can reflect about the potential destinations by thinking about what the law allowed to do with this money. So when this Resolution 63 was enacted in 67, it was to allow small firms to benefit small firms that couldn't go to borrow directly to the international capital market through the Law 4131 mechanism to benefit from foreign funding through the banking system. So a bank would borrow abroad and they would repass on lend this money to a small firm, to different firms. But this law, under a lot of conditions that you can see here on the bottom of the slide, but this law was reformed. And in 73, it was the government, the central bank allowed to invest what was not lent, the share that was not lent, on lend into treasury bills. And then in 74, it allowed to just deposit this money with the central bank, which would take in charge the financial cost, the interest rate, the spreads, the fee, directly, and also the exchange rate risk, directly with the foreign creditor. So I think that this is maybe what Banco Brazil was doing, just placing the money with the central bank, because that way they could earn the fee of the loan, and also could earn the spread of about 1.5, 2.5%, while paying only 0.5% for the interbank money that we're using to fund this. So just to assess the importance of these international loans by the foreign banking offices of Banco do Brasil in terms of the external accounts of the country, I here represent the surplus and deficits of the balance of payment in the black line, and the dotted line is what it would have been without Banco do Brasil foreign entities lending to Brazil. And of course, it could have been a more negative balance. And the gray bar represents how much the international reserve would have fallen if in the absence of this lending. And you can see here that it would have been about 18% lower than they were in 74, more or less, bit more in 75, and even high and even lower by the end of the period. So it was the argument trying to make is this amount of money, this lending was important enough to allow the Brazilian authorities to deal with these imbalances, external imbalances, without need to go through a currency crisis or ask for IMF help. So here we can see the evolution of the Brazilian exchange rate over a period. When we can see that after they put in place the crawling peg system in August 1968, Brazilian authorities were doing these mini devaluations and correcting regarding the evolution of domestic inflation and international inflation. And the systems, and then it kept more or less stable until the maxi devaluation of 1979, and then the final currency crisis that arrived in 83. So while this system and this scheme may have helped to go through the 74 and 75 crisis without suffering any major devaluation, the system became under a lot of pressure by the end of the decade and during the early 1980s because of the increasing needs of foreign capital, and also because of the deteriorating conditions in the international capital markets. So this is a quote from a former Brazilian central bank president, which says already in April 1981, things were already very bad. I stayed over Serrano, which was in charge, the director of the international area of the central bank, that he could make a direct line between me and Eduardo de Castro Neiva, which was the vice president of Banco do Brasil external area. If I ran out of money, Banco do Brasil had a cashier overseas. I don't know how to say it, it's like a caja, no? A caixa. And they indeed, these two institutions indeed, consolidated and merged the external cash accounts into one single account in 1982. So, and they created at the same time a liquidity fund that was supposed to be filled and replenished by Banco do Brasil borrowing in the euro-dollar markets with a target of keeping it at $1 billion and then using this money to cover the shortfall of this Caixa Única. The problem was that by that time, the possibilities and the capacity of Banco do Brasil to raise money in the wholesale market had been seriously undermined. Here we can see the evolution of interbank liabilities of the US agencies and branches of Banco do Brasil. And you can see already in the fourth quarter of 81 how there is a sharp contraction and disappearance virtually of bank deposit with the US agency of Banco do Brasil. They then succeed to raise more money by borrowing through this from other banks, from other banks. But then the Mexican crisis finally brings the whole scheme into serious problems. This is a table prepared by Banco do Brasil where they project the balance and the financial needs of the Caixa Única, this unique cash account, by mid-September 1982. And when they say if Banco do Brasil does not borrow anything in the euro-dollar market, then the account will have a shortfall of $1 billion by the end of the year, end of the month. So in other words, they needed to borrow about 80 million additional per day in order to balance this account. But this was, of course, not possible at that time. And what happened is that the New York agency of Banco do Brasil came under severe liquidity stress during the last part of the 1982. They did not succeed to roll over and make the payments. And at some point, it was developed. They were putting a clearing in quarantine in the chip system in the U.S. and were helped by a safety net that was put in place by a group of 10 U.S. banks, and using also a bridge loan from the BIS to fund these operations. So in the end, and I'm getting close to the end now, the story that follows is that the situation on the external position of Banco do Brasil was stabilized as part of the renegotiating process that started to develop Brazil with the international financial community after the outbreak of the crisis. A part of this process, Brazilian authorities asked creditor banks just to keep interbank deposits with all Brazilian banks abroad, but Banco do Brasil accounted for about 60% of that amount of money, and keep it renewing this every 30 days. Eventually, Banco do Brasil became also the largest Brazilian external creditors. During this period, it started also a process of removal of central banking functions from Banco do Brasil until, which included something I haven't talked about, but we can talk about later, the closure of a movement account, which is and then also the institution or the constitution of an independent central bank in the modern terms with the Constitution of 1988. So to conclude, I think that what this paper shows is the importance of the involvement of Banco do Brasil in the euro-dollar market, and how important was sovereign lending to deal with the balance of payment problems of Brazil, and that the management of these imbalances was indeed perhaps one of the most important or underlying factors and the rationale for keeping this double central banking system in Brazil during this period. While this scheme was useful and proved successful to deal with the 74-75 balance of payment problems, it collapses, and it was not enough to deal with the 82 crisis. And then this triggered a process of reconfiguration of the Brazilian monetary system. So I'm done.
Thank you very much, Dr. Álvarez, for your presentation. And now we're gonna move into the Q&A session, part of the session. We have already 3 people who wrote down questions in the chat, so we'll start with them, asking the 3 questions, and then Sebastián will answer them, and we'll keep it going like that in terms of 3. So if you want to turn on your microphone, Philip, first, and say your question, or if you would rather have me saying it. Well, I'm not sure if Philip is there, but he asked, is the breakdown of Resolução 63 sources of funds primary archival research? That's the first one.
Yeah, okay.
Juan, then also if you want to extend a bit of your question in your intervention. So next we have Juan Flores.
Shall I ask now?
Yes, please.
No, I actually have 2 questions. The first one is the one that I wrote on the chat, because I know that other commercial banks in Latin America were doing about the same, right? So they were establishing foreign branches and then borrowing and lending home. So I was wondering what was so particular about Brazil. Was it a matter of amount or something different regarding regulation? And the other question is a short one. Because you mentioned at the very beginning that Brazil has 2 standby agreements with the IMF, but they didn't use the money. So I was wondering, I mean, what was the purpose of signing those agreements then? Because I mean, that was a conditionality there. So perhaps certain commitments which came for free. So I was wondering why did the Brazilian government sign those agreements?
And the last question of the first round is the Samuel Segura Cobos.
Yeah, thanks, Sebastian, for very interesting talk. I was a little bit struck because of the dual system and the fact that you mentioned that it's very unique in Latin America. Funnily enough, this afternoon I was reading a little bit more on the Singaporean financial system. And it turns out that in 1965, if I'm not mistaken, Singapore had to make a very similar decision as to what type of system to have, to whether to create a central bank or to keep a currency board as they used to have it because they were part of the sterling area, or whether they or what kind of system would they implement. At the end of the day, they decided to keep actually a dual system of the currency board, which was in charge of issuing notes, the bank notes, and the other one was the monetary authority, which was in charge of kind of supervising the financial center that they were kind of aspiring to do. So I was wondering if, it would not be rather an interesting framework to take a look and consider, to contextualize a little bit better the Brazilian example in Latin America. And also if there was any such division within Brazil as to Banco do Brasil issuing banknotes and the Banco Central doing something more the supervisory role, or was it, there wasn't really any such difference? Thanks.
Thank you for your questions. Now we'll have Sebastián answering them.
Answer?
Yeah, and please, if you want to raise your hand or tell us in the chat for the next round of 3 questions, we would appreciate that. So, Sebastián, thank you.
Okay. So for the first question, not sure I understood correctly, but yes. So the list of the list of Resolution 63 lenders that I show is a list that was made. I found at the Lloyds Bank archives, and they have they have the amounts of all the creditors, lending banks that lend money to Brazil during this period. But it was information provided by the Brazilian Central Bank. So potentially it is possible to reconstruct the lenders, a list of lenders for the whole period. That's what Paulo David Cruz has done, but because all these operations were published in the Diário Oficial da União, which once a month they publish all the authorized transactions. But yeah, this is something I have not done, but it could be done. So the other question, going to Juan's question, yes. So there is similar process going on all over Latin America during this period with banks. I have studied the case of Mexico, but it was also the case in Argentina, in other countries. Important banks, Latin American banks, expanding overseas and getting involved in the Euro market, and then using this money to run international businesses. The major difference in this case is that it was a function specifically performed as part of a foreign exchange policy. Well, it's not a foreign exchange policy, but a balance of payment policy, because it's very clear that that is not something you will observe in Mexico. In Mexico, it was, for instance, bank running this, using this money to finance also the balance of payment of Mexico, but in a less planned way. It was private banks doing this, running their businesses, while in Brazil, it was manipulated, and it was done on the shadows, in the sense no one really knew what was that the balance of mostly in 74, 75, one of the worst or more affected countries, and they get out of this crisis without any kind of devaluation, without going to the IMF, while most of the Latin Americans had to go to the IMF. So I think this is a major difference. And then the other question about why they kept signing, that's a good question. And I don't know, in the sense, there is two things. When I read about this, I asked myself the same question. So why are they signing this? There are some, one reading, what you will find in the literature, is that they were trying to provide the market with a good signal. Say, okay, we are in good, our accounts are fine, we have the IMF seal, so we can borrow abroad. I don't know, they stopped doing this because even if they don't take out the money, they had to be supervised by the IMF. And that was kind of a conditionality, something that Brazil was very reactive to. But what is even more surprising is that many other Latin American countries were doing the same. I think actually Uruguay signed for 7 years and never really used money. So that is something that needs to be looked at. I haven't found many references in the literature of why was the strategy of Latin American countries in doing this. I mean, in signing with the IMF and then not using the money, not necessarily using the money. Then with the Singapore point that Samuel raised, yeah, I didn't know about that. It's very interesting. It's in a way, I understand what you say. I had to look at the details, but in Brazil, it's kind of a different setting. In what sense? It's not that they have a currency board and that they were issuing notes. It was the responsible for the notes after reform and for emission was the central bank. And it did it so all of this was decided at the National Monetary Council, and then it was responsible of executing these emissions. The Banco do Brasil had or performed some activities, but it couldn't issue notes and it couldn't lend to the treasury, something that they did before. It was the central bank who was responsible to do this. So it was mainly it was executing some responsibilities of the central bank on behalf of the central bank, especially with regard to foreign exchange operations. But yes, I have to take a look at this setting and trying to see what would if there is a possible comparison or not.
Okay, so far we have 2 more questions for round 2. So if there are any additional questions, please let us know. I'll start by reading Philip's question. So the usual story about the dual banking system is about internal ends, especially increasing lending to the agricultural sector under Delfim Neto. What's the link between Conta Movimento, the instrument that Banco do Brasil used to expand liquidity, and the external sector? That is the first one. And then Gail Schreiner has another question. So if you want to open your microphone.
Okay, thank you. My question, Sebastian, I think you've gotten at this in pieces with a lot of the other questions. But can you a little bit about are you getting me?
Yes.
You hear me? Okay. Can you kind of give us sort of the institutional context that governed the Banco do Brasil's activities? Because it has a lot of different activities and a lot of different responsibilities, but it's kind of unclear to me which of those were institutionally defined and which were not, which were sort of informal arrangements. So I think it would be helpful if we could understand exactly what the relationship, the institutional relationship between Banco do Brasil and the central bank was.
Okay.
Thank you. So far, I don't see a third question, so I'm gonna jump in using my hosting powers. And so something that really intrigued me in your paper and along the presentation is that all this started with a military coup that changed the government, and then there were some constitutional changes, and all these laws come from that moment. And then you have the dual system, and you have the treasury, the government. But I didn't see this, and I was quite intrigued. How were the power relations? Were there any tensions? Was all this very coordinated? Um, I thought you have a table with the functions that each institution had, both banks, but were there clear cuts in what they were doing, or were there overlaps? And even though there was the CMN to coordinate all these, was this like a natural flowing process, or were there any tensions among the actors making these decisions, particularly during the crisis?
Okay, so if I understood correctly, Philip's question, the first. So how does, so I guess he wants to know to what extent this intermediation with foreign funding relates to, could be related to credit to the agriculture sector. So Banco do Brasil was the main provider of credit in Brazil, and especially for agriculture, and it was the bank that has, because it was subsidized credit, right? But when you look at the balance sheet of Banco do Brasil, the credit portfolio is only 25% of the bank. And there are many other assets. So, and the thing is, something I have to check, but if they were using this money to provide more loans to the agricultural sector, I should see in the balance sheet of the bank, in these periods where the bank is borrowing more abroad, I should see like an increase in the share of the credit portfolio. Something I have to check more carefully, but which I haven't seen. So the credit portfolio doesn't really change. That's the reason I think they're using the money to put it in the central bank, basically. This leads to the other question Philip asked. Which is how does it relate, or how does Banco do Brasil relate to this movement account? This is something I didn't mention, but a big issue in this new system was that Banco do Brasil and the central bank were connected through this movement account, which was basically it was a deposit account of the central bank with Banco do Brasil. So it was a liability to Banco do Brasil, and Banco do Brasil could borrow from this account to finance their operations. In that sense, they were actually creating money, because they could finance whatever, and then the Banco do Brasil would put the money to balance the balance sheet. And it became quite important, became about 25% of the balance sheet by some time. The thing is not very clear how they manage, because it looks like a lot of things going on in this account. It looks that by times, for instance, Banco do Brasil made a payment in foreign exchange on behalf of the central bank, and then debited this account, right? So I still have to do more work and trying to see. I definitely think that the borrowing through Resolution 63 is related to this account, but I'm not clearly seeing how. And yeah, so, and there's another point is that well, no, I'm going to stop there. I will go through the other questions. So, Gail, institutional context of Banco do Brasil for the development of this kind of operation. That's a very, I think, good point, in the sense that that I haven't looked at it. No, in the sense that I understand in a way I can identify the different directorias, no? So the different areas of Banco do Brasil that were involved in in developing these activities. In the sense, there was Gerencia, the foreign operation, there was an international area, and there was a Gerencia de Cambio, which is a foreign exchange department. But I cannot make links in how they interact between them within the decision and government structure of Banco do Brasil. I'm not sure how, and then, so that this is something that escapes me. To me, it looks like it was very informal, but it must have been, of course, determined by the organizational structure, given that it's a huge organization. And in terms of then how does this relate to the operation of the central bank, what I see is that it was, and that kind of links to Sergio's question, it looks to me that it was mostly arranged in a very informal way. In what sense? So the president of Banco do Brasil was a member of the National Monetary Council, and so was the president of the central bank. And there were in total like 6 members of this board. It was chaired by the Secretary of Finance. And all these people were meeting once or twice a month to coordinate and to execute these kind of activities. So, and I have the minutes of this minute. They never really addressed directly this kind of logic I'm developing here. It's not that they discuss it in this way. And so but I think it's a system that built up in a kind of de facto way, in an ad hoc way. It was not planned in this way. But then exactly, yeah, I mean, then I cannot think outside of the National Monetary Council of other kind of institutional framework in which these 2 institutions would have coordinated their actions. Related to Sergio's question, so so that table comes from an article from a Banco do Brasil publication. I think it was never, so the law established some guidelines for the activities of both banks, but I mean, the system developed and was built up as it developed in a way, because the central bank, for instance, was created by law in December 64, and it started to operate in April 55. They didn't even have a building by that time. So many things were delegated in a de facto way to Banco do Brasil. Even the Conta Movimento was supposed to last for a couple of years, and then it lasts for more than 20 years. So, and then there must have been some overlap, but for instance, in some areas there was not such an overlap. And an important area is for the intervention in the foreign exchange market. In the foreign exchange market, and the management of the foreign exchange operations of the country were performed by Banco do Brasil. It was Banco do Brasil, for instance, the one that paid Brazil external debt. It was not the central bank. And Banco do Brasil, for instance, performed many payments on behalf of the central bank, but it was through this institution that were, so it was Banco do Brasil the one managing the foreign liquidity of the central bank in a way. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
Yeah, I think it does. Thank you very much. I don't know if there are any more questions. If not, let me take the opportunity to invite you all to our next presentation, which will take place on November 16th by Jerome Putville, and we'll be presenting a paper on lotteries in the late medieval Low Countries. In the chat, you can find the links to the event and to join us in the Financial History Network, where you can receive the papers and more information about our events. Thank you very much, Sebastián, for your presentation.
Thank you everybody for attending.
And thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you in our next events. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sebastián.
No,
thank you everyone.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.